evening, everyone, and welcome to this panel talk on British politics under Rishi Sunak. So very topical right now, and this is part of a series of events to mark the 30th year anniversary of the Department of European and International Studies. So I'm your chair tonight. My name is Marianna Griffini. I'm a PhD alumna also in the department, so I've been around for long, and I'm now a lecturer in international political economy in the department. So tonight I'm joined by, in order from there, Dr John Narayan, Senior Lecturer in European and International Studies, Dr Lucia Pradella, Senior Lecturer in International Political Economy, and Dr Christopher Holmes, Senior Lecturer in International Political Economy. So the panelists will have around 15 to 20 minutes to speak each. At the end, there will be time for Q&A, and at 7:30, we are going to have a reception served here. So I'm going to introduce first. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to introduce first Dr. Christopher Holmes. So he's going to talk about how public understanding of economic policy has changed over the years and how that change might help determine what kinds of policy are possible today. So without further ado, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Marianna. As usual, I wrote that description months ago and didn't really factor it into what I'm talking about today, but it's certainly on topic anyway. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to speak at this event. I've been at EIS for 8 or 9 years now, and even in that time, I've seen it grow and develop in really exciting ways. New colleagues and so on. So I really feel like the department's going from strength to strength. So it's a nice opportunity to celebrate what my colleagues are doing as well, I think. Okay, so in what I'm going to say today, I'm going to approach the question, Rishi Sunak back on track or off the rails, in terms of thinking about the future of the Conservative Party, really. So rather than my own personal position on Sunak's tenure, when I talk about success, I'm really talking just about the electoral fortunes of the Conservative Party in this talk. So I'm kind of restricting myself to that. And I'm taking that approach because this is obviously a really important question. Because the upcoming general election, I think the last date is at some point in January 2025, which can take place. It could be a complete disaster for the Conservative Party, right? Some commentators are talking about the wiping out of the parliamentary party. They're putting it in those terms. But even if that's a bit overblown, I certainly don't think a 97-style Labour landslide, which amounted to around 170, 180-seat majority in the Commons, I certainly don't think that scenario is out of the question, given where the polls are now. It's a real uphill battle for the Conservative Party, I think. Why is this? Well, of course, it's incredibly difficult for them because having been in power for so long, you're surrounded by the consequences of your policy choices, right? And this is a problem that all long-serving governments face. If you think back to the Labour government, by the end of their period in office, they had Iraq around them, and they had the consequences of the financial crisis, which, although it was weaponized in a slightly misleading way by the Conservative Party at the time, of course, it was the failure to regulate finance which left the British economy so open to the global financial crisis. So they had this accumulation of policy failures, which made it very difficult for them to wipe the slate clean when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair. So I feel like the Conservative Party faced this problem multiplied many times now, and of course, you'll all be aware of the kinds of issues they're facing. Crumbling public services is obviously at the foremost of lots of people's minds. The civil service is in disarray, the Home Office particularly, which is making it incredibly difficult for government to pursue their policies effectively. So various things going on there. And of course, Brexit is still hogging the political agenda, which does nothing to help the Conservative Party. On the pandemic response, the polling shows that mistrust over misallocation of funds, the PPE crisis, is still quite high in voters' minds, even at this stage. So I feel like it's probably left quite a long-running mark on the Conservatives' records there. Of course, if they can delay the COVID-19 inquiry, the publication of the results until after the election, that may help them, because I doubt that that report is going to be very useful for the government. I think it will have a lot of negative things to say. But even if they do that, the damage may have already been done, right? We still don't know everything that's going to come out of Matt Hancock's texts in the coming weeks. I'm sure some of you are following them as they drip out of the Daily Telegraph. So, there's problems there. They're fighting on a lot of fronts. And that's before we even get to the Truss Kwarteng mini-budget, which still looms large in many voters' minds. And that's so damaging for the Tories, of course, because a big part of their appeal to voters in recent decades has been on economic competence. So it strikes right to the heart of what their brand is supposed to be. And even beyond the branding, it's also restricted their effective fiscal space to kind of engage in giveaways and effectively buy votes from the electorate in the coming year, because the Treasury and Chancellor Hunt's response to it has been one of really tightening things up, really fiscal austerity response, because it was perceived as an unfunded low-tax budget, and so they had to kind of swing the other way. So, the list goes on these kinds of facts. I'm sure I've missed lots of other things that we all might find problematic, and it's going to make it really difficult for Sunak to transfer what are pretty good poll ratings for him personally onto the Conservative Party. That's kind of the key challenge as I see it in the next year or so, but it looks very, very difficult, I think. So given all of those challenges, is there any route to success in the next general election for Sunak's government? Well, of course, 16, 18, 20 months is a very, very long time, and a lot can happen. We can't predict the future, of course. But for me, at this stage, I think the most plausible route to success, or at least not a wipeout or a landslide defeat, will have to be based on both a fortuitous set of economic conditions and, secondly, a succession of small wins which build up cumulatively to build up a sense of competence. Because, again, competence is an area, not just economic competence, but general policy competence. When an issue is phrased in terms of competence, rather than, say, in terms of ideological or social difference, Conservative Party tends to poll better, right? They're perceived as, on average, a more competent party by the public, on average. So if they can shift the debate into grounds of competency and they can hold that ground, that could help. So on to the two factors, and I'll deal with them in succession: cumulative small wins and a fortuitous set of economic circumstances. On the small wins, obviously recently we've had the Northern Ireland deal. Whatever you think of it, in terms of Rishi Sunak's tenure and his position in the Conservative Party, it's been a relative success, right? The polls in the last couple of days don't show any clear bounce, but it's probably too early to tell. If he can build on that and show, 2 or 3 more distinctive policy events in the next year, if he can show or argue that he has moved the country on from Brexit in some way, if he can say that we're entering a new period in our relationship with the European Union, these things are going to play very well in opinion polling. So that's one area where he could start to generate these small gains. If he can get the fiscal firepower together to offer a pay deal that ends at least some, perhaps a majority, of public sector strikes, again, I think this is going to play very well, and it's going to play into that theme of economic competence where the Conservative Party does well. But again, he is heavily constrained by the commitment of the Treasury to lowering levels of borrowing and to the right factions within his party who want to see lower taxes, who believed in the Truss Kwarteng budget, and who do not want to be seen to be accepting union demands. So there are definitely challenges there, but it's somewhere where he could make some of these small gains, I think. Another area where I think he may have thought he could make gains over the year or two is in reducing cross-channel migration, right? But this is where I think he's almost certainly made a big strategic error. He's made this a prime ministerial pledge, right? The wording is to pass laws to stop small boats swiftly removing illegal arrivals. I suspect that's a slightly tortuous legal arrangement of words there. So he could technically be said to have met this if he manages to move this bill through Parliament. But I very much doubt that many members of the public will kind of fall for that, if it's not accompanied by actual reductions in the number of people attempting to cross the channel in small boats. I don't think the public can be hoodwinked in that way. And so given that, the problem itself is, I'm not an expert on immigration by any stretch, but it seems completely intractable, certainly within the next year or so. So many policy ideas have been tried to prevent small boat crossings by essentially deterrence, building higher walls. And of course, that, the policy that the border force takes is not the driver of levels of migration into Britain, right? It's about global poverty and inequality. It's increasingly about climate change, and it's about conflict, right? So these are things which are not in control of the border force. So, the build higher walls strategy is just isn't going to work. And I'm surprised he didn't see that before putting that on his pledge card. So moreover, the solutions to small boat crossings that are actually plausible are politically unavailable to him. Rejoining the European Union in order to enable better negotiations with France is an obvious way to be able to rearrange the situation on cross-border migration to Britain. But of course, that's completely off the agenda. The re-establishment of better and stronger legal routes for migration is a durable solution. Any expert on migration will tell you this. But anything which involves an increase in the overall numbers or a potential increase is just not possible, particularly for the Conservative Party. But I think a lot of these things would affect the Labour Party if they were in the government as well right now, but they're not. So it's a problem for the Tories. So I think the Small Boats Pledge was a miscalculation on his part, and any spurious claim to success based on passing a bill through Parliament, it won't count for much in voters' minds, is my view. So that's where I think we are on the potential areas where he could, generate some gains, but it's fraught with problems at every turn. So that's where we can turn to the fortuitous economic circumstances and what role they might play. So 3 other of Sunak's pledges include 3 on the economy at the top, 1, 2, and 3. To halve inflation, to have national debt falling, and to grow the economy. And clearly these are just straightforward gambles on the path of the economy, because so much of this is to do with the global economic picture. Not much of it is in the gift of him to really change, certainly not in the next year. But that said, they're pretty good gambles. The Office for Budgetary Responsibility forecasts inflation to drop sharply this year, and growth is expected to return in 2024 for the UK in most forecasts because of changing global conditions, right? The commitment to debt falling is a little bit more complicated. Of course, primarily it's a commitment, it's a flag to commit to austerity, but because the conversation around national debt is a product of the relationship between 5-year forecasts on the route of national debt and the current fiscal rules set by the Treasury. And they're open to statistical change, right? They've regularly been changed, suspended, and so on. So even if growth doesn't enable the debt to GDP ratio to fall, as it will if we have a high GDP level, so they can claim that way if they can. But even if not, there'll be some statistical gerrymandering, I think, which will enable them and Sunak to be able to claim to have met that pledge. So in a way, it's canny. Most of the commentariat has seen through the ploy, but yeah, it looks likely he'll have more success there. But, of course, the caveat here is that there is nothing to say that these forecasts are right, okay? Continuing global geopolitical instability, the war in Ukraine, some other form of crisis, even drought, crop yield problems in southern Europe could have a big negative impact on the UK economy and particularly on the cost of living for everyday citizens. So in that kind of scenario, Sunak faces, at the very least, the problem of having to try and persuade the electorate that it wasn't his fault, you know. So governments regularly do this, try and externalize blame, but it's just another hurdle for him to try and get over. So even on these fortuitous circumstances where I think he's been more canny, there are clear risks and clear potentials for failure. So he's facing a very, very steep uphill battle, I think, if he wants to look at anything like electoral success. Okay, how am I doing for time?
You still have around 7 minutes.
Great, okay, so I get to do the second thing I wanted to do today, which is to think a little bit longer term, beyond the election. If we assume that if not a wipeout, then a defeat of the Conservative Party does take place, what are the options, or what are the scenarios looking forwards 5 or 10 years? And here, for me, the natural answer to the question comes thinking about generational voting patterns, because as everyone knows, the Conservative vote skews very much to older members of the community. So to put some stats on that, from Onward, a right-of-centre think tank, 18 to 24s, 14% report voting Conservative, 65s and over, 56% report voting Conservative. So there's a clear line, a correlation between age and the intention to vote Conservative. And so we're used to thinking about this situation as a conveyor belt. As citizens grow older, the more likely they are to vote Conservative. That's been the case for a long time. But that conveyor belt is now breaking down, which presents additional challenges for the Conservatives moving forward. John Byrne-Murdoch in the Financial Times, who's brilliant, I really recommend his reporting, he has found through survey data that millennials, so people born between 1981 and 96, which includes myself, have not drifted rightwards in their voting intentions like every previous cohort in the 20th century. So that's to say, for most, drifting towards the Conservative Party as they age. Instead, they've tended to remain left-wing, particularly economically. British 35-year-olds are, in Byrne-Murdoch's words, the least conservative 35-year-olds in recorded history. And of course, it's not hard to see why this is the case. For my generation, we came of political age in the optimistic and fiscally expansionary period of the Blair era, which had all of its own problems, of course, but we were used to the idea of improvements in public services and improvements in pay packets and so on. And then from 2010 onwards, austerity and asset price inflation, which are a product of Conservative Party iron, many would argue, have really bitten my generation very hard, and so people have turned away from the Conservative Party. So if this conveyor belt of citizens from left-leaning economic attitudes to right-leaning attitudes has broken, it obviously presents a huge problem for the Tories. The key question then is whether that is a permanent effect or whether it's unique to my cohort, millennials. Is that conveyor belt broken for good, or is it fixable? In his article, John Byrne-Murdoch lumps in millennials with, as he puts it, their Gen Z younger cousins, which includes those born in the mid-90s up to 2010, i.e. all of those of voting age younger than millennials. So this implies, and you see these two generations lumped together a lot, it implies that they might follow the same pattern of skewing or staying relatively left-wing in their economic attitudes as they age. And in terms of the distribution of economic benefits in a kind of material sense, there's every reason to think that that would be the case. Because Generation Z has been hit just as hard by austerity as millennials have. And I've got some various statistics on that, which I will skip for now. So we might reasonably expect Generation Z to be equally resistant to the drift to right-leaning economic platforms on the same reasoning as millennials. But there's evidence again that there's another twist in the story here. In a series of large surveys, my colleague Lucy Barnes at UCL recently found that compared to the general UK population, those in Generation Z, so the youngest voting age cohort, actually on average tend to hold less progressive, less left-leaning economic views than either millennials or older boomers, right? So why might this be? This is a kind of confusing statistic. It's also in Bobby Duffy's work in the Policy Institute as well. It's being reproduced. Well, I mean, I'm going into speculation mode a little bit here, but I think, you know, you could look at it and say, well, the younger generation just agrees with austerity-led economic principles. They've seen declining spending, lack of investment in the economy, and a failure to increase levels of tax to finance public services, and thought, yes, I'll have more of that, please. But a more plausible explanation, I think, is rooted in the fact that Generation Z have known almost nothing other than austerity since they came of voting age. The state spending that has been defended since 2010 has been almost entirely to the benefit of older citizens, the pensions triple lock being the most obvious example, while spending on services that benefit the young most, education, healthcare, unemployment, and support for complex healthcare needs, has borne the worst of the cuts. So, in a sense, Lucy Barnes's data and the data of others suggests that this new generation might be in some ways alienated from the state. That's to say that on average they don't even recognize the state as an economic force capable of improving their condition. So in a sense, I mean, that's a very pessimistic ending in a way, but it offers a new basis on a kind of almost a tabula rasa in this younger generation, where the Conservatives might think about rebuilding their appeal and how they might pitch themselves to that younger group in contrast to their largely older-facing strategy beforehand. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So now we are going to have the presentation by Dr. Lucia Pradella. So Lucia is going to discuss the revival of the labor movement and the government's confrontation with it from the railways and beyond.
Okay, good. Hi everyone, and thanks for organizing this and chairing Marianna. Let me start with this picture. So there are two demonstrations here. One during the so-called Winter of Discontent in Britain in 1978-79, and the other one you may remember or have been part of it on the 1st of February for the March of Education for Education. So many commentators have drawn parallels between the two movements, and both movements were actually and are a reaction on the part of the workers to high inflation and declining living standards. But in the 1970s, it was a Labour government that was facing down the opposition of a highly unionized workforce in a wave of strike that involved up to 4.6 million workers and affected everything from transport to hospital work to grave digging. And the government eventually negotiated an end to the strikes in February 17, 1997, but this ultimately led voters to switching to Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party. Today, we could ask ourselves whether Rishi Sunak is facing a similar fate. So will the wave of strikes that started on the rails with the rail strikes also lead to the demise of Sunak, and what will come afterwards? I think that in order to answer this question, we need to look first at the political economy context. In the 1970s, stagflation, so rising inflation and unemployment, reflected a structural crisis of accumulation of profitability, and even if workers eventually managed to get pay rises, this crisis eventually led to the rise of neoliberalism and monetarism, with frontal attacks on the part of Margaret Thatcher on trade union rights and also a major restructuring of the UK economy. And this took place in a period of expansion. I have here a chart by Malcolm Roberts that shows that after the early 80s, there was actually a period of expansion of the U.S., of the economy, what is called the neoliberal recovery, that took place against the backdrop of a period of expansion of the US-led hegemonic order, first in the global south and then also in the former Soviet bloc. Today, I would say that rising inflation expresses the multidimensional crisis of this very system of accumulation, a crisis that first erupted with the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, and then hasn't really been solved. And today, rising inflation, high inflation, is linked to the shocks and the kind of interruptions to supply chains due to climate catastrophe on the one side and the COVID-19 pandemics. And on the other side, we see how the Ukraine war, as a major inter-imperialist conflict going on right now, expresses the crisis of the unipolar order under Western and US hegemony that had underpinned that period of economic recovery. And importantly, the kind of shortages to supply chains and resulting from supply chain shocks have allowed companies with sufficient market power to hike their margins, as exemplified by record profits of energy companies like BP or Shell. And there are studies that shows that, for example, in the UK, profits is actually driving at least 59% of inflation. And in this context, as also Stiglitz argued, monetary policies reduce inflation only at the cost of working people purchasing power. But I think it's important to bear in mind that the consequences of inflation and monetary policies are not just distributive, because working people that face hunger and destitution are forced to work longer hours or take on more jobs just to be able to afford to heat their houses or their flats or to give food to their children or themselves. So there is a dynamic that actually increases exploitation in the workplace, and this is a major way in which capitalists are trying to counter the lack of economic dynamism and long-term decline in the rate of profit, as highlighted in this graph by Michael Roberts. But something changed in the summer of 2022 because we witnessed the emergence of a new labor movement that started to the private sector and started exactly with those workers who were deemed as essential workers during the pandemic and couldn't work from home like most of us, but had to go to work and face the risk of COVID, the risk to their lives, transport, etc. And on the one side, the fact of being deemed essential, right, to the economy boosted the confidence of workers and also their self-consciousness of their disruptive power. And when, at the beginning, they accepted pay freezes, etc., but when the kind of lockdowns came to an end and companies with large profit margins offered below inflation pay rises, the anger of the workers started to increase, right? And the anger combined with their self-consciousness of their power, right? Which is, I think, an important element, especially when this self-confidence was further amplified when the economy reopened in the autumn of 2021, and this reopening actually exposed major labor shortages. For example, lorry drivers got really great pay incentives just to get a job. So what we see in terms of the dynamic of this new labor movement is that it's a movement that started in the private sector with rail workers, British Telecom, Royal Mail workers. Then we have a kind of eruption of local disputes by lorry drivers in good transport, bus drivers, refuse workers, dockers, and also some major disputes in manufacturing. And there has also been an important outbreak of wildcat strikes in the North Sea oil rigs, but also among Amazon workers who reacted by basically walking out to basically offensive pay offers by Amazon in the summer of 2022. And then we see how from the private sector, we have some major unions in the public sector, from Education Union, the Teachers Union, UCU, the University Workers Union, also Unison, junior doctors, nurses, etc. So also the public sector increasingly is involved in this new labor movement. The common denominator, I think it's important to highlight, is not just pay, but also working times and working conditions, and more essentially the question of power relations at work. Because all the disputes have some common denominators. There are issues about job losses, reorganization of terms and conditions that include mandatory Sundays without being paid for basically extra hours. In the case of the railways, there is the closure of ticket offices. There are more general issues of precarity of employment and also around pension. And I think that there is a general understanding that this kind of depression of workers' purchasing power and increasing poverty among working people is linked to the deterioration of the quality of work and working conditions. The third element, I think, is an emerging consciousness of being part of a working class, the idea that we are facing similar problems and we need to unite, coordinate, and use our collective powers. And so we see how, like on the 1st of February, there were 500,000 workers on strike on the same day, and more workers will be on strike on the 15th of March, because there is a drive from below, from workers, to be united and use our power in society. And I think there are two quotes that I think express this. Sorry. On the one side, I think this sense of being part of a class, that it's not just a sectoral issue, right? For example, very hostile media try to push Mick Lynch from the RMT to say, well, this is something that concerns the rail workers, and his answer was always to show that it's something that affects everyone, that we can be better off, all of us, right? It's not one sector against another. And I was really struck by this quote from a Arava bus driver in London, who said, well, we know it's a very wrong society. I drive across London, where you can see the 1 million houses and the 3 million houses for some, as well as the big estates where there's lots of people worried about their full bills and the cost of a big shop. There was a woman I know who gets on my bus, and I've known her for years. We nod and smile at each other, and she thanks me when she gets off. One day she said to me, I might not be coming on the bus anymore. So I asked why, and she quickly said, very quiet, because I'm not going to Tesco's anymore. I'm walking to a food bank. That was it, a 10-second chat, but it summed up a lot for me. So there is an idea that this is a labor situation, but concerns overall society. And at the same time, there is also the idea that workers have the power to transform this situation. And I think that Mick Lynch really expressed this idea when he said, we all have the power, a wheel doesn't turn, a light doesn't turn on without us. We deliver the services that keep this country running. We want a fair share, and the rich and powerful need to realize it. We cannot be divided, right? And I think this is linked to my last point about the characteristics of this strike, that is raising broader political demands about economic policies, for example, about the government's response to inflation, but also around public services, because, of course, the NHS strikes raise the question of the privatization of the NHS. The education worker strikes raise questions about what is education for, what is kind of funding in education, how should the public sector work. And at the same time, because of the pandemic and the recognition of workers, especially nurses and NHS workers, during the pandemic, and the fact that the cost of living crisis affects everyone, there is growing sympathy in society for the strikes. So how did Sunak and how are they responding to this mounting movement? So I think that Sunak's strategy has been so far to cast himself as a kind of moderate Tory. So after blocking negotiations on the rails and the NHS, for example, he's now, offering some some negotiations, in intense negotiations to the nurses, and he also decided to extend the energy bill help in order to attenuate the impact of inflation and so try to mitigate the growth of the labor movement. But at the same time, while there are some openings, he's also waging an attack to the right of strike itself. And I think that because of the weakness of the Tory party, it is quite difficult for them to make concessions, and what they are trying now is to divert attention away from these class conflicts into divert this anger that is widespread in society against immigrants and refugees. And so it was quite telling, I thought, that Suella Braverman trying to co-opt and appropriate the enough is enough slogan, right? Because clearly the kind of motives behind this kind of interest in the question of immigration seems to be quite politically motivated. And what we witnessed in response to this was quite a strong statement on the parts of the unions to these attempts to use racism to divide the working class, also denouncing the responsibilities of the government in fueling the far-right violence against refugees that we have seen in recent weeks. I think that if we look at the kind of Starmer strategy in all this, I think this picture, which is actually from King's College Hospital during the nurses' strikes, that basically brought this kind of fake Starmer's mannequin on the pickets, really sums it up, right? So Starmer is no way to be seen on the picket lines. He actually disciplined members of the party who kind of supported the strikes, but he's also at the same time saying, well, I'm actually giving you the parliamentary opposition to the anti-union laws, right, to this new legislation to limit the right to strike. So, and I think this helps explain why so many workers who are on strike, even if maybe they will vote for the Labour Party, don't think that either the government or the Labour Party will offer a solution to their problems. And I think this leads me really to my final point. I think that one major difference between the strikes in the 70s and today concerns the nature of the action itself. In the 70s, in general, strikes were indefinite, and they were generally run from below by the shop steward committees, and increasingly became run from the top. In many cases, like the Ford strikes, they were initiated by members against the union officials, and through indefinite action, and this indefinite action actually allowed different sectors to coordinate and go out together, and that's why we had one of the biggest day of action with millions of workers out all together, which was one of the biggest days of actions after the general strike of 1926. And what happened with Thatcher afterwards was that she sought to prevent exactly this kind of dynamics through a series of anti-union legislations that banned a lot of practices, like, for example, secondary picketing or spontaneous strikes, that these kind of tactics had amplified the power of the strikes before. And 4 decades of anti-union legislation in this country have actually reinforced the grip of the union bureaucracy over the trade union movements, and it's basically the top leaders of the union or the executive who decide when to start action, when to pause action, etc., etc. But by pausing action during negotiations like the nurses did, like UCU, our union did, and many other unions did, also including the CWU and the RMT, the control over the strike and the pace and the dynamic of the strike is back on the side of the employers or the government. And I think this is, and it also makes it much more difficult to coordinate strikes between different sectors. So we see that strikes that have achieved significant pay rises, like, for example, in the private sector, like bus drivers are an example, who went or threatened indefinite action and got 10-12% pay increases, show that, there is still this kind of tactics being used, but this is also very much controlled from the top. And I think that the RMT decision to suspend action to put the latest offer to members is quite significant, because it shows how this decision basically kind of weakened the momentum around the 15th of March. So we can see how this kind of strategy on the part of the union leaders doesn't put sufficient pressure on the government. And so even if Rishi Sunak is quite weak at the moment, it keeps him on track, I would say. But at the end, I am more optimistic than my colleague Chris, and I think that it will be the strength of the labor movement and its capacity to control their action and their unions that will give us the final answer about that we are trying to discuss today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucia. So now we are going to hear from Dr. John Narayan about why the government is so scared of anti-racism.
Oh, is that what I said I was going to say? Okay. Hi, everyone. How you doing? You okay? You don't want to go home yet? You sure? You might want to after this. Okay. So what I'm going to do for you... Look, my Thomas the Tank Engine one did not come out very well. It's not very good, no? Okay, so what I'm going to do to you is give you a narrative around how anti-racism is functioning in the current moment, all right? I don't really care about the Tory party. I don't care whether Sunak's on track, off track. I just want him out. But necessarily what I'm going to say to you is that what may replace him may be worse, okay? So be careful what you wish for. So let's start with a little anecdote, if this works. Okay, so this was quite funny because this was on the run-up for Sunak becoming, on his run to fail to become Prime Minister, actually. And there was this idea that, he might solve this culture war that we're in, this kind of clash of culture. So this was posted up at 7. I want you to pay attention to the time. Saturday, 23rd of July, 2022, right? Then, this actually turns up at 5 o'clock on the same day, where Sunak says he would cap the number of refugees to coming into the UK. So he answered the own question, right? He wasn't going to solve the culture war. In fact, he was going to perpetuate it. And in a sense, what we've seen is the ramping up of this form of inherent racism with the announcement yesterday, or 2 days ago, around this migration policy. Now, I slightly differ from Chris. I think they know what they're doing, and they're doing two things. One is an ideological play, and the other is that these has economic exploitative effects. So if you essentially kick everyone out of the asylum system, and they theoretically are in Britain, one could call that a reserve army of labor that you could exploit really quite well with migrant labor. But who knows how that's going to play out. In many ways, that policy doesn't make sense because it's not actually feasible, right? We don't have enough places to keep these people. And actually, at the moment, we don't have an agreement to deport anyone anywhere, including Rwanda, because it's in the courts. But it plays very well ideologically. But let's come back to all of this. Because in a sense, this is all rooted, and look, my Thomas one came out all right on this one, is this off-the-rails narrative, and I always love, we have to call him the slightly large controller now. When I was a kid, we used a different word, and we're not going to use that. The slightly large controller, I always used to think was the monopoly man. And what I want to show you is actually this form of racism is actually all rooted in our political economy, and the coming off the rails of the British economy and also the global economy, okay? Because I don't just do jokes. Right. But what I want to do is give you anti-racism. So let's rewind back to 2020 when we were all in the summer of COVID. Do you remember that? And do you remember when we all found out that racism existed in the summer? Like it was a real thing? Like we just all stumbled on it. Do you remember that? Like, damn, society is racist. We had the emergence of Black Lives Matter. We had, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, which was killing disproportionately non-white people in particular, yeah? We had this idea of this revelation that society is racist. It had its kind of apex in Britain with the throwing of Edward Colston into the Bristol Harbour, from which he accrued his fortune. Do you remember that? It was good old days. Unfortunately, they put him out, didn't they? I think we should have left him there. What was interesting was that movement was based on something we call abolitionism. Yeah, you ever heard of that? In the media, some of you may have heard of defund the police, but in a sense, all abolitionism is this idea that actually we should refund our society's institutions and build institutions that liberate all of us, across race, across class, across gender, across sexuality. What was the government's response to this? Well, it gave us what we called the CRED report, or the Sewell report, which in a sense basically said institutional racism is not a real thing. It was actually written, quite a lot of it, by BAME people, but not social science researchers from everywhere else, right? And it was headed by a guy who doesn't believe in institutional racism. We then had the most diverse cabinet assemble against this, right? This is Kemi Badenoch. I like to call her Bad Enoch. Because in a sense, she's presenting an idea that essentially racism is not a thing that we really need to think about, and we don't need to think about. And I'm going to tell you why they don't think we should talk about it, because they don't want us to link it to issues of class and capital, all right? And then we had the return of white supremacy. This is Boris running over a little Japanese kid, as you do, all right? And we thought, hey, it's all back to normal. Why was Black Lives Matter and that anti-racist movement so pivotally rejected? Because in a sense, it referred us back to a prior era of British anti-racism, which links itself to black power, that links itself to third worldism, that links itself to thinking about our borders, thinking about our society, and it imports into our context rabble-rousers like Malcolm X. This is Malcolm X visiting a neighborhood not far from my neighborhood in Smethwick in Birmingham, yeah? And it references a prior era. And that's not the form of anti-racism, actually, that Britain's comfortable with. Britain's not comfortable with linking race and class together. If I say racism to you, some of you will think, oh, it's about names, it's about this. But actually, racism is about structural inequality, its relationship to the market, its relationship to class, and its relationship to exploitation. And this era was referenced by the Black Lives Matter movement. That's not the issue. That's not how we do anti-racism in Britain. We do anti-racism like this. It's what we call multiculturalism. You have steel bands, you have samosas, you have saris, you put it together, you have an event, you call it diversity inclusion. You get people that look like certain people, you put them on boards, or you put them into parliament, and then they start deporting everyone. Yeah? Does that sound familiar? Who knew? But what I want you to think about is, how does that work in the current moment, right? What is anti-racism's role? So there was a rise of anti-racism. It was denied. It hasn't really disappeared. It's still around. So, for example, you would have seen a few months ago, there was a young black unarmed man who was killed by the police, Chris Kaba. Yeah? And to show you how far down the media's narrative anti-racism has become, Sky News reported on a march that he was on, or people were on for him, as a march for the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Yeah, they misappropriated that. So, but why has that happened, and what can anti-racism do in the current moment? So what I want to go back to is, why is Sunak doing what he's doing, and what is anti-racism's role in dealing with that? All right, so if you look at contemporary ideas about international political economy, there are some authors who suggest that neoliberalism, the era that Lucia nicely mapped out for me, is coming to an end, right? And in places like, say, such as the US or even the EU, there is a return of the idea of the state, that the state should intervene into the economy, that the state should start to pick winners. So, for example, in the US, not only do you see the kind of buy US policy, but you also see in the conflict between the US and China, the US trying to kind of destabilize global commodity chains, specifically around microprocessor chips, yeah? By banning and stopping things, and the state intervening to try and ramp up the production of these very important parts of our various component parts of our lives, our phones, our laptops, and other things, right? And so people think neoliberalism is dead. There was an idea that leveling up, for example, was part of this narrative of the return of the state, right? Britain became a bit of an outlier, though, because it hasn't really done that. There was a moment, if we rewind back, before the Lettuce won, Yeah, do you remember the lettuce?
I don't. Forgot.
You forgot the lettuce? How could you forget that? They outlasted Liz Truss. But Liz Truss actually did mount the state in ways that actually does resemble a very kind of alternative way of intervening into markets. The 130 billion pounds literally found, we hadn't had any money for nearly 10 years. There was no magic money tree. And then literally they found 130 billion pounds just lying behind the thing. And part of this is accounting tricks. So, for example, Chris was talking about that. You would have, a few months ago, you would have heard a fiscal black hole of 70 billion. Do you remember that? That's now a fiscal surplus of 30 billion. But we did have this attempt to try and intervene. That didn't go very well, and then we've actually ended up, Britain is a bit of an outlier compared to the US and Europe because it's actually picking to do austerity again. Yeah? What has been interesting is that they went round the ways of doing that, right? So Sunak actually was at some point Chancellor here. Then he got replaced by another tax avoider. Then there was Kwasi who tried a supply-side revolution and got himself fired. Yeah? And then we ended up with a white guy called Jeremy. And he brought back austerity. All right? Why is this important? Because actually this is underpinning, this instability of the British economy is underpinning the extension of a form of authoritarianism that needs the racism of what we started with. And it needs it to kind of underpin it all. So what has also been happening to the British state, not only in migration policy, but in protest policy, in our bordering, in our policing, in our union legislation, is an expansion of state authoritarianism. So if the state hasn't come back to intervene in the economy in the progressive ways we may want it to, it certainly has not gone away. It hasn't been away for 40 years. In fact, it's expanded in ways you wouldn't even know, right? If you go and read the policing bill, you'll probably you'll never litter again, yeah? If you go and read what you could now be done for going to protest, you wouldn't protest again. You can get under a year's jail sentence, 51 weeks, very, very easily. And this is because as our economy, and again, I think Lucia was very good on this, as the economy has kind of faltered, certain fault lines have emerged, not only across what we could say traditional forms of organized labor, but also other points of contraction in this culture war. So what the British state has been doing is using these others to shore itself up. Migrants, yeah? Workers, trans women in particular, yeah? I mean, who goes into a toilet now who isn't scared, apparently? Right? And the state has been expanding its authoritarianism, using moral panics to underpin what is really a state that's in crisis and is actually being opposed at multiple points. So the legislation isn't just for the fun of it. It's to say, why did we end up with the policing bill? Because you had the emergence of Black Lives Matter. You had the emergence of Extinction Rebellion. You have the emergence of Just Stop Oil. That's not good for our economy, apparently, right? Because it demands more fairness. It demands redistribution, or it demands institutional change. And so the migration policy that we talk about is actually part of that. We've all forgot about Priti Patel, haven't we? Like at one point, Priti Patel just was the face of evil. And then Suella Braverman was like, nah, that's my face. Yeah? She ramped it up another level when she started militarizing the border. She literally started militarizing. Do you remember this photo opportunity which you hopped on the Chinook? No one knows why. I mean, I don't know how this gets done for expenses. How much do you think that cost? That's a major, I mean, look at that. And we have this kind of thing. But what I want you to think about is this form of state racism. And racism is always state racism. Even when we think about who sets the tone for everything, it's state racism. Yeah? Racism is fundamentally linked to the institutions of the state, the courts, the police, the education system, all of these good things. But like I said, there's been a challenge to this, hasn't there? Again, Lucia did this really well. I don't really have to talk about this too much. In a sense, although the economy itself is slightly deglobalizing, interestingly enough, British multinational corporations have done very, very well. They actually don't need us to buy stuff because they sell stuff in other markets. Yeah? So what we're having now is actually a contestation across multiple fronts, right? Across issues of policing, across issues of what's happening on the border, about ecology, but also now the basic standards of living. So I want you to actually think, when I talk about state authoritarianism, actually the state's doing this because it's not too sure about itself, right? Rishi Sunak isn't too sure about himself. That's why they come up with these bizarre policies. What is the role then of anti-racism? The anti-racism that was alive in 2020, was alive in 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, it never went anywhere. What is its role then, I want to talk about lastly, about in this current moment of crisis? Well, we've got the re-emergence of organized labor, yeah, which is great, the RMT. So really the real people off the rails are the RMT, yeah? Next week it might be us. I had pictures of that with people actually here. Oh no, I better skip. But I want to think back about what anti-racism can give us to understand this current moment. And in fact, this is what I'm saying. I don't actually care about the Conservative Party. This is Ambivalence Sivanandan. He's the most wonderful anti-racist. Most of you probably don't know who he is. But in a sense, he did a version of what I'm doing in the 1980s. And after the Brixton uprisings, which were massive, set up a massive set of uprisings across the country in 1981 around race, they were called race riots, we call them urban rebellions. He writes at the end of this very, very famous piece, and he says, look, it's not merely that a free market economy requires a law and order state, but that even in its passing, it leaves only the option of a mixed economy with a corporate state maintained by surveillance. They are but two sides or two shades of the same authoritarianism, the one more modern than the other, but neither speaking to a birth of a new society. Well, when I think of that, I think of, well, the Conservatives are the free market economy. That's the thing that might be moving out, and then I might end up with these two, yeah? Forms of valorized, bizarre politics, where actually we should be more scared about what the Labour Party is doing and accepting, which is, if you looked at the news 2 days ago, they were like, that's fine. We agree with this. A few months ago, Rachel Reeves came out and said, well, the real problem is the Conservatives haven't deported enough people. They're not deporting enough people quick enough. If you listen to what Chris said, this is most likely your future government. And I find that quite scary. So in effect, who cares about Rishi Sunak? Maybe we should care more about what Keir Starmer and these lot are going to do, yeah? What's the role of anti-racism in this? Well, the role of anti-racism in this is to make sure that the issues that we think essentially maybe just to do with race, maybe just to do with gender, are brought back into the idea of a general contestation around our economic settlement in society. So when we talk about not only fair wages and having jobs and having state services, we also remember that part of the relationship of capitalism is run through issues such as race and racism. And so when we say enough is enough, which we do, right? We've had enough. We also say, well, we'd like enough of the state violence that systematically oppresses and kills people, both within society and at its borders. So we want a real radical change. I just don't want the return of Keynesianism. It wasn't that great for people in the global south. All right? And so anti-racism's task, and that's the community I'm speaking to, right, who I write for, their job is to show how these disparate struggles, such as survivors from Grenfell, the Black Lives Matter movement, what's happening in Palestine right now, the movements from Indian farmers against neoliberal reform, what was happening in Latin America and is still happening, which is the challenging of neoliberalism. How do you bring those things together? How do you create forms of solidarity that bring things together? And how do we move forward collectively as a movement? Because part of what Chris, I think, unpacked is, well, there's been an absence of these ideas of collectivity in the state. But in reality, let's just own them. Those are left-wing, socialist, communist values. They're anti-capitalist values, this idea that we share common heritage, we share loyalty, we share responsibility for each other. Those are the values of the left. And they haven't disappeared. They're here. They're in this room. They're on the streets. They're on Twitter. They're everywhere, right? And I think we've seen elements of this. So I, again, reference what Lucia says. Don't worry, I'll be finished in a minute. If you look at it, what's driving the unions towards saying that the UK government is complicit with all of this stuff is the anti-racism that existed in 2020. It's the legacy of that. It hasn't gone away. It's still in the communities. It's still fighting off the police brutality that's killing people. It's still fighting off Yarlswood and all the other places that are killing people at borders. So in a sense, what we have to bring together when we get rid of the Conservative government is actually to fight off the return of a state that will surveil us, control us, and also kill us. And I make no bones about those words. Those are the exact words I mean. So, to go back again to what Chris was saying, I'll end with Sivanandan. In a sense, that's our job. We have cultures of resistance, right? And those values that underpin those cultures of resistance, like I said, comradeship, sharing, solidarity, all of those things, those are the communities, and they exist because the state is scared of them. They exist in the ecological movements. They exist in the organized labor movements. They exist in the Black Lives Matter movements. They're ideas of a different society. And as he says, we have a world to win, and capital shall have no dominion. That's basically where we're going now. So my faith is not with the Conservative Party or with the lack of the Gen Z's ideas of what the state can do, but it's actually with these radical movements that will move us to a different society. So it's neither off or off the rails. We want to totally radicalize the rails. All right? Thank you.
Thank you. So very thought-provoking talks and perfectly on time. So now it's time for questions. Shall we take 3 at a time? Is that fine? Okay. So who would like to ask some questions? Any
Comments, questions?
protests? Okay, yeah, so let's start. Yeah, if you want, you can briefly introduce yourself, just your name and affiliation. Maybe.
I'm Catherine, I'm a PhD student from the IAS. I hope this doesn't seem like random because John mentioned Palestine. I was sort of thinking about the announcement by the Tory party that they're going to ban other bodies from boycott movements. And I was just wondering how that might figure into the idea of authoritarian capitalism, but also would be interested to hear maybe Chris, if you have an idea of like how that figures in terms of the Conservative Party's strategy and the kind of wider implications of that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So shall we take another 2 questions? Anyone?
They all came for the drinks, no?
Yeah, there is a student there.
Oh, there's a student. I didn't see you. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so first we'll take the student's question, then we'll come to Tom's question. Yes, please go ahead.
My question is with regard to the trade union movement, right?
Can you stand up? Sorry, and talk loud, please.
My question is regarding to the character of the trade union movement. So basically, you see the demands are mostly like an inflationary proof, wage hike and all, but we don't see political questions coming up. So even in the context of enough is enough, we are trying to organize people. We are trying to organize people, but what is the broader political alternative is so when you hear mid-range and they themselves speaking so they don't talk about any political party or formation of any political vanguard as such. So they're leaving people to the spontaneous. So it's apart from showing moral anger, it's not leading to anywhere. So what's your insights on that?
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom, would you like to ask a question? Okay, okay. Yes? Go ahead.
Law students from UCL have heard this speak this up here. Maybe I can give you a small answer to your question because in British law, it's very hard to have a political strike. And it's also very hard to have a general strike. And political strikes, basically, it's illegal. But it is not my problem because as a communist, I got all these leaflets from the UCU, from IMC, from the LGBE union in UCL. I can see all these strike demand, most of them, are economic. But the thing is, as the black youth wisely reflect, if we want to change the society fundamentally, we need to let workers raise their political demands. Stop, just talking about distribution all the days, but they have to know, they have the power, they can do something to change the society. And if they don't do this, I read one article before about how the inflation is created by the Bank of England to force people to suffer inward poverty. Also, as Lucia, her article about the inward poor in Europe is very good. I highly recommend this.
Thank you.
So how can we, the first thing is, how can we let workers raise their political conscience? They have good economic conscience, but they have to have a political conscience. We can see that McLinch, all these general secretaries from different unions, they are playing as the speakers bureaucracy, which means they cannot truly represent the working class. The working class needs something, right? But how? How can we replace them? Okay, as the black dude.
I'm the brown dude.
Oh, brown dude. Sorry. Because I didn't ask this to you.
It's okay.
Okay. He talked about, yes, we don't care about Sunak, we don't care about Starmer, but, you know, after 1984, the general defeat of the general strike, okay, a worse thing comes, the neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher become more powerful. So how can we stop them? How can we let workers do something, right, to change it? I told this with the doctor, his name is Tim Craig. You make a note of him, to see, he working so hard.
Tim Pringle?
Yeah. Which he said, yes, we always talk about something. Yes, we all know we should change something, but the question is how to do it. Like, what is to be done, right? So that's all I want to ask for three of you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, would you like to start? Who wants to start?
John?
Who wants
Shall I
to
start?
address? Yeah, okay.
Okay, the first question was about Palestine, right? Yeah, so I mean, look, in some essences, that is quite an easy one because that's already been mobilized around, you know, the kind of tricky way that Palestine is used in order to move to different debates and shut down other debates. So Palestine, I think, already exists as another already. I think what's interesting is for anti-racism, Palestine is one of the touchstone forms of internationalism that still really exists. Like, it's still really there. And in some ways, what neoliberalism was quite good at for doing to the anti-racist community was to shift our debates into national ideas. So I don't want to give you the full history of this, but like essentially, if you think about the solutions to racism that British society thinks, they're all national solutions. Yeah, they're like black and brown faces in high places, on sports pitches, you know, selling you books, writing you books for white people to change themselves, running workshops for Guardian readers. They're not actually linked to the debates that anti-racism had in the 60s and 70s, which were actually about structural change, not only in Britain, but in other places. So actually what we need to do is repopulate ideas of Palestinian internationalism across different forms of struggle. We've actually lost that as an anti-racist community. And part of that isn't just that, it's also the way demographics have changed, our lives have changed. So that's what I would reorient it in. But it's definitely used already by the state as another other. Like it's already, you know, there are many of them that flow about on this kind of right-wing loopy stuff that you find both in Twitter and in government. And I think Palestine is already being used quite well. I'm not sure that totally answers your question, but also it's being recorded, so I'm trying not to get myself in trouble, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I'll come in as well. I think John's right to use that other terminology. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's conspicuous by its absence, Palestine in you know, current Conservative Party conversations, to the best of my knowledge. But I think, you know, the Conservative Party, and to some extent all governing parties, are good at co-opting situations and using them to their benefit. And at the moment, that's set within a kind of culture war context. So I think I pretty much go with John on how it would play out if it came back on their agenda. But the other part of it, of course, is that Britain doesn't really have a coherent foreign policy presence at the moment. You know, everything is swallowed up by Brexit, and you know what's left is some posturing over Ukraine, as far as I can see. So, you know, I feel like we've got to get some kind of coherence in our foreign policy to drive those kinds of decisions, and I don't see it happening anytime soon. But I can't offer you any more detail, I'm afraid. No, that was it for me. Thank you, Lucia.
Thanks. Thank you for your questions. Well, regarding Enough is Enough, the Enough is Enough movement, I think on the one side, Enough is Enough filled the vacuum left by the Labour Party, especially last summer, and kind of tried to coordinate and amplify the voices of the unions involved in the strike action. At the same time, we see that the unions that are part of the Enough is Enough movement, like the RMT, the CWU, and the University College Union, have a kind of quite similar tactics, right? So they have 1, 2 days, 3 days blocks of action. It is quite kind of controlled from the top of the union, and very often the unions have called off action when there was an offer, or on the part of the employers, or even in periods of intense negotiations when there wasn't really an improved offer on the table, like happened with our union, UCU. And so we see that they're not even making very much progress in terms of what they're achieving, but I think this reflects also a kind of fate, or a kind of the fact that this organization is also very much linked with the left of the Labour Party, and the idea that somehow the Labour Party is an alternative, so they're not raising the kind of major political issues and the kind of also political economy issues behind the problems that we are facing. Also inflation, it's not just a distributive issue between wages and profits. It's not just profit-led. We also need to look at major transformations in the global economy, the question of supply chains, but also the crisis of Western imperialism, right? And this kind of crisis of the unipolar world order that is leading to that has led to is manifested in the war in Ukraine after the invasion by Russia. So I think this is one of the reasons why the Enough is Enough movement is not raising major questions that I think we need to raise when we look at the question of inflation and the priorities of the government. They're not raising, for example, the question of military spending. Why isn't anyone raising the question of military spending when clearly it's a major question that concerns what we want in society and what we can achieve? And I think I go to the second part of the, and on the other side, a union that is outside the Enough is Enough movement, which is a Unite the Union led by Sharon Graham, we see that she kind of challenges this kind of link to the Labour Party, and I think her election was significant because her manifesto was basically, her program was to focus on working place organizing, but still, and they have adopted a much more radical strategy in terms of indefinite action, but at the same time, these struggles are quite fragmented and still don't raise the major, I think, political issues. In terms of what we can do, so I think the question also of, so what I was trying to say is that on the one side, we see how the union bureaucracies and their links directly or indirectly with the Labour Party are a major kind of limitation to the radicalization of these movements, and at the same time also to the achievements of the demands, because, well, I think the example of UCU is quite telling. So where basically we have post-action, even if the pay offer is still 5%, hasn't changed at all, which will mean a 15% pay cut, because this is almost more than 10% pay cut this year, and we don't know how much it will be next year. And despite that, the union leaders have decided to stop the action. So in terms of concrete achievements, I think if you don't raise the political economy issues, also your possibilities of achieving a real pay rise are quite limited at the moment. And this leads me to the second point about what we can do. I think the example of the 70s is quite interesting because it was through escalation and coordination that workers can take control back, right? So for example, if workers decide when to pose action, when to put an offer to members, when to disballot, etc., then probably if they offer you, make an offer that is 10 percentage points lower than what you ask, you wouldn't do it, right? So I think, so if workers take control back by creating strike committees, like for example happened in the North Sea rigs, where we have strike committees that organize strike actions against the kind of intentions of the unions that actually were quite hostile to the action just last summer in September 2022. So we see how there are the first steps of self-organization, attempts to organize from below, and I think we should reinforce these structures within each union and trying to coordinate our action much more in order, to get a proper pay rise, but also to be able to link with all the other movements, all the points that John made about the kind of broader societal issues about racism, about social reproduction, about military spending, etc., that I think are very much connected.
Thank you. Excellent. So I'm going to gather other two questions. Yes, at the back, and then Tom. Yeah, yes, please.
Hi, hello, my name is Janet. Sorry, great speech. I came in the end, but it was nice to hear you and hearing your speech. But my question is, can we start rethinking racism? Because because I'm from Guinea-Bissau, that's West Africa. 36 years, that's a long time. So in my mind, Africa was totally different from what I've seen. And I was really happy to be back. I was really, really happy. And I'm also very grateful for this country because I think if I wasn't living in the UK and if I didn't acquire the necessary knowledge or the understanding, I wouldn't be able to see my country or my continent the way I did. So the reason why I'm saying is rethink racism because in my village, it's just us, the only black people. If a white person gets in, or if I see a white person, I'll be shaking. What are you doing here? Sometimes it's not that I'm racist, it's just strange to me. And I don't know much about history. We don't know, not all of us, we don't know much about history, but sometimes we have to rethink. Are they actually racist, or are they trying to protect themselves? And do we really know where we belong to? Are we actually doing something for ourselves? Do we really know who we are? I have my nephew who goes to school, and the teacher asked me, he was born here, but he said he's from Guinea-Bissau. So I think it's time for us to start educating our children and get to know a little bit of who we are. I think when you are raised in this country, you think that you belong to the community you don't. It's not because they don't want you to, but try to find your identity. And I think we living in this global world, we can do so much better. We collaborate together because we're building up schools back home, but our organizations in the UK, we are working with people from here, from different parts of the world to do good for my country, which will impact the world.
Thank you. Tom, please. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions that they're kind of linked, but I want to maybe link up some of the themes you've all spoken about already. I'm interested to see what else you're thinking about.
He's trying to start a fight.
Say again?
He's trying to start a fight.
So, Chris, you mentioned that you thought the Sunak strategy around small votes, small wins idea was politically naive. You were actually surprised that you could go down that route. It seems very plausible. Whereas John and Lucia kind of suggested actually this is a calculated ideological strategy that emerges not only from conditions in the current political economy, but because it's a well-worn strategy to create xenophobia, a fear of the other. So I think there's an interesting difference there that I'd like to make a comment on. And I say so because I came of age during New Labour as well. I didn't come of age in a way that I thought New Labour were great. I remember New Labour as invading Iraq, the war of terror, urban poverty, blight. I remember Blair as the anti-Thatcher. So I guess that's kind of, there's a question of political consciousness, right? And that leads to my second question, which is I think there's a tension here I'd like you all to comment upon. So Chris mentioned around the data that, was it the Gen Z that potentially could go right-wing or go Tory because they only know austerity, so they may be more susceptible to some of the kind of consequences. I've not heard that before, that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah.
The other part is the radical consciousness emerging from workers, which are demanding and unifying about conditions, pay, and lifestyle. So there seems to be a tension here, right, in a societal tension. But that means there must be some type of demand, right? These parties, they also poll. So on the one hand, you've got these parties which are supplying essentially racist policies. So there's a radical consciousness, a form of consciousness that's emerging there. And on the other hand, you have kind of left-wing forms of consciousness. So there seems to be a polarization at play. A lurch to the right and a lurch to the left in some ways. So maybe there's something to say about that.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? So the last question, I think. Okay, there are a couple more. Okay. Yeah, we can take both.
So
Sure, yeah.
somewhat related to this, but so the small boat strategies, I think, is very much an electoral tactic. I was wondering how much you not necessarily agree with this, but I think it might be somewhat an electoral tactic. Because in 2017, the Conservative Party lost their Liberal voting bloc, great, but replaced it with the red wall voting bloc, which was left-leaning in economic terms, but socially quite conservative, traditional, however you want to work there. And that's a huge voting bloc. And if they're able to hold on to that voting bloc, they could conceivably win the next election. How conceivable is it that through the social conservative campaigns like small votes, that they can ward off reform, but also ward off Starmer? And of course, could Starmer accidentally slip up and speak that? Because his stay silent strategy might not work.
Thank you very much. Yes?
Sorry, the what?
Thank you.
Did you say normalization or?
Normalization.
What do you mean exactly?
Well, like, for example, teachers' union, it's seen as quite typical teachers' part of teachers' union, whereas,
I can't hear you, sorry.
Sorry.
I was just saying that it seems quite typical now that teachers are part of teachers' union, or certain, like, workers who part of the union, for example, rail workers who part of the RMT, and it's quite normalised now. It's not seen as abnormal as it used to be decades ago. And I was wondering if you think that factors lessen the impact.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me go for small boats first. I think probably both of these things can be true at the same time. I think I wouldn't disagree that there's a kind of there's a way of ruling through divisiveness at work there, and I would agree with what John's saying at one register. But I don't think that precludes the fact that it could still be a cock-up in terms of how it works in public opinion. Everything I've said has been about the register of public opinion. So, I'm not really taking a position on it that way. I'm just interested in what the polling data says. And my feeling is that even if that is the stated intention, I feel like if the strategy fails on its own terms, and it was on the pledge card, he's just going to struggle to play the argument that, well, it's the lefty blob stopping me doing what I'm doing. I might be wrong, but I just feel like this time it's not going to work. My wife works in the Home Office, so I see this stuff right up close, right? And the sense of disaffection there is so strong. The texts are out there for everyone to see, not just Matt Hancock's, other people's as well. The civil service is creaking, right? So that is not going to enable them to do their thing. And I just feel that it's this lefty blob of civil servants argument isn't going to wash this time. I could be wrong, but that's my feeling, right? In a sense, maybe I'm actually being the optimistic one here because I think the strategy will fail. So maybe there's a sense in which I'm optimistic. I hope that comes to a little bit of your question. You know, in terms of Starmer's response, you know, I think the stay quiet strategy is good, but it's too long for him to sustain it, right? You know, if the Conservatives are going to have to push the election right to the end, I think, unless something really unusual happens. And you can't keep it going that long. And I too worry about their agenda being co-opted by the Conservative policy, basically. It's a problem, but I just think 20 months, it's a long time. They will have to change tack. I couldn't say where it's going to be to, but yeah, it's a very important question. And on Blair not being a land of milk and honey, I totally agree. Somehow I've hit the kind of centrist candidate on the panel unintentionally, because all of those things I found very problematic personally as well. Again, I'm just interested in the public opinion. And in millennials, Blair polls well still. People say, yes, I still agree with him whenever he comes on the radio. So I'm not talking about my views on him, but in general, there is a layer of the age cohort in the millennial area which has those kinds of economic views. And then, yes, the polling data is very surprising, but it's being reproduced in lots of big surveys, right? It's not tacking left on, it's not tacking right on social issues, it's just on the economy. And that's why, you know, my tentative hypothesis is that there's a kind of alienation from the state as an economic actor which can benefit people. So that's quite a specific phenomenon. It's not connected to broader claims about political salience necessarily, but it is there. And so, you know, that is going to, along with, you know, the senior levels of the Tory voting population passing on, sadly, that is going to change the map. And I think it's unpredictable. It's going to be a new space that Labour and Conservatives and other parties will have to try and occupy. And you know, I see this myself as a teacher in my students, you know. It's not easy to pigeonhole or predict what students' views will be on issues I present to them in the lecture theatre in the way it was when I started 10 years ago. So it's interesting, I think.
Okay, so first question, thank you. And I know where Guinea-Bissau is. The person who taught me my first rendition of Franz Fanon and Cabral was from Guinea-Bissau. And he used to share his food with me, so it's also has a special place in my heart. In a sense, what you're describing isn't what I describe as racism. I don't really care what people think of me. You don't have to like me. You don't have to think that my children could hang out with your children. I don't really care. What racism is racism that discriminates and is racism that kills. And it kills at the border. It kills through poverty. It kills through unemployment. It kills through bad healthcare. These aren't things where we should all just get along. These are real issues and real problems. That's racism. And that's the thing we want to deal with. These other stuff, fine. You don't like me. You don't like what I have to say. You don't maybe want to promote me. That's a bit of an issue. We need to deal with that as well. But I'm more interested in these other things. Okay? And that isn't let's all get along in the global village. The problem is the global village is cut up. It's bordered. We're cutting off from each other. You know? It's very easy for me probably to turn up in Guinea-Bissau, but it's not easy for someone from Guinea-Bissau to just turn up at our border. You know? And that, for me, is racialization. It's racial domination. So, look, when they change that, I'm willing to just... I actually always tell my students this. I don't actually want to teach the stuff I do. I'd rather teach you aesthetics and poetry, you know? I actually hate what I teach because it's really quite depressing half the time. But lots of it is also very wonderful, and we'll come back to that at the end. What was the next question? Was Tom's, right? Was the tension in consciousness between...
Polarisation, like the youth and then also the workers, and how that's been involved.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we shouldn't see these things as just like opposite, should we? I feel like it's really interesting when I teach students here who, you know, look, King's students are not all left-wing students, right? And I ask them to, so when we do class, and sometimes I don't get them to read the Communist Manifesto, but I ask them to define what their state is. And then if you read the end of the Communist Manifesto, it has 10 intermediate points of what an emergent communist society may look like. And all of the students literally say their desired state is this transitionary state, right? The only thing they really disagree with is the abolition of private property, and I always think we could work on that. So, you know, like free education, free healthcare, pensions, all of these things are actually transitionary stages. So I actually think a lot of these young people who have been disenchanted from the state, which is not necessarily the worst thing, because the state is not there to save us. The state is not going to save us all the time. Like, it's part of state violence is the state, right? But I think we could reorientate some of those people. And I tend to have lots of faith in young people. I think young people are brilliant and actually get things way better. So I actually think maybe the workers need some of the consciousness of the young people as well. And this is what I'm getting at. There are multiple movements, communities of resistance, as I call them, across society that actually need to be brought into dialogue with one another to maybe push some of these claims into more radical ways. And I think that is happening, yeah? Or we can remind people about that. So, you know, when people say, oh yeah, but at, you know, my workplace, and you might say, oh, do you remember when you all signed a statement about Black Lives Matter? Do you remember what you said? You were going to eradicate racism in the workplace. Like, we can mobilize around these things. And we can reimagine what the state could do, and that's very important. The small votes thing, look, we agree. I think it will fail, because I think the Tories will lose the next general election. But what's more worrying, yeah, is the Labour Party has accepted, and this is the other thing, you're going to get the Labour Party, yeah? You ain't going to get nothing else. This is a workers' revolution. You're going to get the Labour Party, and the Labour Party have already said, we won't repeal the Nationality and Borders Bill. They accept these things. You know, they will put this into practice. And Blairism, what's interesting about Blairism is why we all have a penchant for thinking Blairism was okay was that it was on this frothy, you know, the end of neoliberalism where it was frothy and it could, you know, give you a fancy hospital via PFI and things like that. But my abiding memory, which again is Iraq, is Afghanistan, is the 2001 riots in Oldham, Bradford and Burnley, the end of British multiculturalism, the rise of mass Islamophobia, the Tony Blair turning up on TV and saying, I don't care how much David Beckham earns, it's fine. I remember that. These are my moments of Blairism. I really don't. And the idea that people still trust him is the most depressing thing I've heard on this panel today. I am depressed. All right. So I think it won't work. I think they'll lose. But I think what's more worrying is that what's coming next already accepts these parameters. Like, can you imagine a Labour Party? Well, I can, but there's a very famous phrase, again from the Right phrase, where he says, what Enoch Powell says today, the Conservative Party makes policy on tomorrow, and the Labour Party legislates the next day. And this is the mainstreaming of far-right politics into our normal domestic politics, and we should be very scared and oppose it at all forms. Last question, do I think we can recover the internationalism? Yeah, I think we can. I think we can see that. Identity politics is a really interesting term because, you know, identity politics as a term was created by black feminist writers coming out of the US by the Combahee River Collective, who had an idea of identity politics. And the whole point of identity politics was that your identities fed into an expansion of class struggle. But now identity politics is a slur, right? So I don't think we can recover identity politics. I just want to put that one out there. Yeah, we have silos. There's always bizarre debates about what I call the oppression Olympics. But actually, when you put people into a room with each other and they're allowed to connect and organize with each other, I think people do find forms of solidarity. And in fact, we don't probably focus on the forms of solidarities that have emerged in the last 10, 20 years. But we do have lots of work to do on that. And then the thing on unions, I would just say, look, trade union density actually is not very high. It hasn't really recovered from the decimation of it. But it's what we're seeing is the quasi-public sector trade unions really kind of getting involved, and we should celebrate that. And I would just say anyone who can, join a union. There you go.
Good publicity. Anyway, so thanks so much for your question. I just want to start with Tom's question about the small boats and whether this is a calculated ideological strategy or not. I would say that this is a political and economic strategy, not just ideological. And I think that in order to answer this question, we can't avoid talking about the responsibilities of the West in the war on terror and the war in Libya and Syria, and how these wars have pushed down conditions, expanded poverty, and pushed millions and millions of people out of their countries or as internally displaced people. And these wars have also increased international tensions, leading now to major confrontations with Russia, which is another imperialist power. And my argument is that, maybe this is a bit counterintuitive, one of the goals of the war on terror, one of the conscious goals, was exactly to push down the conditions of these people, to create a reserve army of exploitable workers in conditions of either unemployment or underemployment. And that the kind of militarization of the borders of the European Union, of the UK before or after it left the European Union, the goal of these policies is not to stop people from coming here, but it's actually to make sure that these people are in this condition of dependence and are actually available, are disposable to UK, European capital, Western capital. And I have done quite a lot of research about the war in Libya and the militarization of the borders. I talked to black African immigrants who arrived to Italy, and many of the people who arrived to Italy didn't want to come to Italy. They would have preferred to stay in Libya. Libya was one of the main countries of immigration in Africa, had quite good living standards before the West attacked it. They would have preferred to stay there, maybe go back to their country, but this basically came to an end. This came to an end when we attacked Libya, creating mass poverty and supporting a system of predation on the part of criminal militias that we keep in power. And also we have fueled this militarization of the borders that at the same time traps people in Libya and pushes them towards Europe. So many of the people, when they are trapped in the detention centers in Libya, they can't go back to their countries. It's much more dangerous to go back to their countries than to come to Europe. So it's almost a kind of, it becomes almost a kind of only choice that they can make once they are in this system that the European Union is funding. And I think, well, the other day, Sunak tweeted something which I was really surprised they didn't delete. He said, well, if you come to the UK illegally, you will be denied access to modern slavery, to the UK's modern slavery system. So he's saying, well, if you come illegally, you won't be a slave here. And he didn't delete that. But I thought, well, this is actually the modern slavery system. So you are creating masses of people who can only come illegally because you are basically denying all legal routes to come to this country, right? And you are exposing these people to all sorts of exploitation, trafficking, slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So these policies are creating slavery today. And both here and in other countries. In Libya, after 2017, slavery has become the dominant mode of production in the country. These are the dominant labor relations in Libya caused by Western imperialism. And what we are seeing today is how these relations that we exported abroad by exporting democracy through the war on terror are rebounding here and are affecting all of us. So, I think that if we want to talk seriously about how we solve this crisis, that someone told me today shouldn't be defined as a cost of living crisis, but as a cost of profit crisis, actually, or a cost of capital crisis, I think the labor movement needs to address these kind of questions. And I think the diversity of the working class today, the fact that the workers who are most exploited today are people of color, are women. Even at King's, we have a 14% pay gap. Women are paid on average 14% less. workers of color are paid on average 19% less than white workers. We see how these issues, and explicitly in our disputes, these issues are really correlated. But I think because of the political limitations we discussed before, this is not really made explicit. But if we make explicit and we look at the kind of global context and make issues around UK imperialism, around militarism, around racism, etc., part of this movement, we can really build up the strength of the working class to achieve something different, to achieve liberation. I think this is what we should be discussing, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. So our panelists, let's give a big round of applause.